In the summer of 1961, NASA named its lunar program after a god. Not a general, not a president, not an engineer, a god. The choice landed quietly in internal memos, approved without ceremony, filed without explanation. The Homeric hymn to Apollo, composed in the 7th century BC, opens with a declaration that makes the choice feel almost too precise. I will remember and not forget Apollo, the far shooter, the god of light, the god of reason, the god whose arrows never missed. It was perfect. It was obvious. It was the kind of name that doesn't require justification. Except for one detail. In the same 7th century hymn, same text, same source, same ancient hand, there is a passage that NASA did not put in any press release. It describes the moment before Apollo existed, before the god of light and reason and healing had drawn a single breath, before the most celebrated deity in the Greek pantheon had done anything at all. It describes his mother, Leto, wandering the Aegean Sea, pregnant, alone, refused by every island, every shore, every piece of land in the known world. Not because she had done something wrong, because Hera, queen of the gods, wife of Zeus, had sent word ahead of her. Any land that gave Leto shelter would suffer. So every land refused. Mountains turned away. Coastlines withdrew. Populated islands said no before she could ask. According to the Homeric hymn to Apollo, circa 650 BC, Leto traveled from land to land, seized with the pangs of birth, and not one would receive her. Delos, a tiny, barren, floating island that had nothing to lose, finally said yes. Not out of courage, out of having nothing left to protect. That is where Apollo was born. That is the origin of the name on the rocket that carried 12 human beings to the surface of the moon. The question no one seems to have asked is simple. Why would the most powerful space agency in history choose a name that begins with exile? But history has a way of leaving behind traces that don't fit the story we were told. Let's start with what we know. Apollo is the god of the sun, of light and reason, of music, poetry, prophecy, and healing.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
In every classical survey, in every mythology textbook printed in the last 2 centuries, he appears the same way. Radiant, perfect, the most celebrated deity in the Greek pantheon. The Romans kept him without even changing his name. The only Olympian who crossed from Greek to Roman mythology intact. That alone tells you something about his power. You don't rename what is already universal. Artemis is his twin, goddess of the hunt, the moon, the wilderness, cold where he is warm, wild where he is ordered. She carries a silver bow and runs with wolves through forests that no human has mapped. She is the protector of young girls, of animals in the dark, of everything that lives at the edges of the civilized world. Virginal by choice, answerable to no one. The ancient Greeks understood her as the counterweight to her brother, the moon to his sun, instinct to his reason, the untamed to his harmony. Together, they are the celestial twins, the two faces of nature in perfect opposition and perfect balance. This is what we were taught. And it is not wrong exactly. When NASA's Abe Silverstein proposed the name Apollo for the lunar program in 1960, he later said he chose it because the image of Apollo riding his chariot across the sun was appropriate to the grandeur of the proposed program. Silverstein knew his mythology. The name was selected for exactly the qualities the world associated with the god: beauty, power, precision, the mastery of light and distance. In 1973, NASA's Skylab program considered several names before settling. In 2017, when the agency announced the program that would return humans to the moon, they named it Artemis, the twin, the sister who follows, the one associated with the moon itself, with the night side of the sky, with the territory that waits beyond the boundary of the known. Apollo went first. Artemis came after. The brother, then the sister. It reads like a natural sequence, a poetic continuation, a respectful nod to the mythology. But here is what Silverstein knew, and what the press releases never mentioned. Apollo and Artemis are not symbols of power. They are the children of a woman who had nowhere to give birth. And if you go back to the actual myths, not the sanitized school versions, but the original Greek texts, what you find is not two radiant gods at the peak of their power. What you find is two children who spent eternity doing one thing above everything else, surviving what happened before they existed. If you look at the surface, it makes sense, but the moment you scratch that surface, the whole thing starts to bleed. Callimachus was a poet and scholar at the Library of Alexandria, 3rd century BC. One of the most rigorous literary minds of the ancient world, a man who spent his career cataloging, verifying, cross-referencing. Not a storyteller who embellished, a scholar who documented. In his Hymn to Artemis, Callimachus records a scene that appears nowhere in the school versions of the myth. Artemis is a child, still small enough to sit on her father's knee. Zeus, king of the gods, most powerful being in existence, is in an indulgent mood, and he tells his daughter she can ask for anything. Any gift, any domain. Whatever she wants, it is hers. Most children, offered everything, ask for everything. Artemis asks for 6 things. Callimachus lists them precisely. She asks to remain a virgin forever. She asks for a bow and arrows. She asks for the wilderness as her domain. She asks for 60 ocean nymphs as companions. She asks for 20 river nymphs to care for her hounds. And then she asks for something that stops the scene entirely. She asks her father, she asks Zeus himself, to never give her a city. Not mountains, not oceans, not power over men. She specifically, deliberately asks to be kept away from cities, away from civilization, away from the world where people are given to other people, where women become possessions, where belonging to someone is not a gift but a sentence. She had just been born. She had not yet lived a single day in the world she was already refusing. According to Timothy Gantz in Early Greek Myth, Johns Hopkins, 1993, the most comprehensive academic consolidation of variant Greek sources, Artemis's requests to Zeus are consistent across multiple ancient traditions. The rejection of civic life is not a late addition or a Roman embellishment. It is present in the earliest sources. It was always part of who she was. The question Gantz does not ask, because it is not a scholar's question, it is a human question, is why. Why would a child who had never been hurt ask, as her very first wish, to never belong to anyone? And here is where the crack appears. Because Artemis did not enter the world as a child enters the world. She entered the world watching her mother suffer. She was born first, on that barren floating island that had nothing to lose, and the Homeric hymn to Apollo records what happened next. Leto's labor for Apollo lasted 9 days and 9 nights. 9 days. While every goddess on Olympus except Elathea, the goddess of childbirth, stayed away under Hera's orders. While Leto lay on the ground of an island that almost didn't exist. And Artemis, newborn, hours old, never having eaten, never having slept, served as her brother's midwife. A child who had just arrived in the world, spent her first hours making sure someone else could arrive in it too. And then she asked her father to make sure no one could ever do to her what the world had done to her mother. This is not mythology. This is a psychological profile. Forget everything you think you know about Apollo and Artemis, because this is where the real story begins. Let's talk about Apollo, the god of reason, of harmony, of healing. The god whose name NASA chose to represent humanity's most precise, most controlled, most technically flawless achievement. 12 men, on the moon, brought back alive. Here is what the Homeric hymn to Apollo and Ovid's Metamorphoses record about the god of light and healing. Apollo loved a woman named Coronis, a mortal. She was pregnant with his child when she took a human lover. Apollo's sacred bird, a crow, white at the time, saw it happen and flew to tell him. Apollo's response was immediate and absolute. He killed her. Not in anger, not in a moment of blindness. He sent his sister's arrows into her while she lay in the funeral pyre. He burned her alive. Then, at the last moment, he reached into the fire and pulled out the unborn child, Asclepius, who would become the god of medicine. The god of healing created the god of healing by reaching into the fire he had started. Ovid records his reaction afterward. Apollo did not grieve her death with dignity. He grieved it with the specific agony of someone who knew, in the moment the arrow landed, that he had done something he could not undo. He turned the crow black, not as punishment, as a monument to what he could not take back. And then there is Marsyas. Marsyas was a satyr who challenged Apollo to a music contest. When Apollo won, and the sources are consistent that he won legitimately, he did not accept victory with the grace of a god who has nothing to prove. He flayed Marsyas alive, tied him to a tree, and removed his skin. Ovid, in Metamorphoses Book 6, records the satyr's final words. "Why do you tear me from myself?" The god of harmony, the god of reason, the goddess who wanted nothing from the civilized world and asked her father to keep it away from her. She had a hunter named Orion. The sources vary, and the variance itself is the story. In some versions, Orion was her companion, the only man she ever allowed close. In others, he was her equal in the hunt, the one being in the world who could match her in the wilderness she had claimed as her own. Hyginus, in Fabulae, and Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca, both record a version where Orion is killed, not by an enemy, not by a monster, but by Artemis herself. In the most psychologically precise version of the myth, it is Apollo who arranges it. Apollo, seeing his sister forming an attachment, seeing her, for the first time, moving toward rather than away, issues a challenge. He points to a distant shape moving across the sea and dares Artemis to hit it with an arrow. She does not know what she is aiming at. She hits it perfectly. She always hits perfectly. The shape was Orion. She placed him in the stars afterward. The constellation bears his name. She is the one who put him there. There is a reading of this myth, present in the scholarship of Timothy Gantz and implicit in Burkert's analysis of Apollo's character, in which Apollo's challenge is not a coincidence, in which the god who could not survive his own attachment to Coronis could not allow his sister to survive hers, in which the twin who became an armor of control dismantled the one crack in his sister's armor of distance. And this is where it gets interesting, because Artemis did not stop hunting after Orion. She did not retreat further into the wilderness. She did not punish Apollo. She did not grieve in any way the sources record. She simply continued. That is the most devastating detail in the entire mythology. Not the loss, the continuation. Go back to the beginning. Delos, a floating island. the only place in the world that said yes. Leto is on the ground. Labor has lasted 9 days. Every goddess on Olympus has stayed away. And Artemis, born hours ago, having never eaten, having never slept, having never been held, is helping her brother arrive. She does not know yet that she will spend eternity on the edges of the world. She does not know yet about Orion. She does not know yet that her first act of love will become the pattern of her entire existence. That she will spend forever caring for the thing that is arriving, while she herself remains at the threshold, never quite crossing into the place where someone might care for her. She does not know any of it. She is just a child, doing what children who have watched their mothers suffer learn to do before anyone teaches them. Taking care. Zeus will ask her what she wants. She will climb onto his knee, and she will ask, in that small voice that the sources render with devastating simplicity, she will ask to never belong to anyone. Not because she doesn't want to, because she already knows what belonging costs. She is hours old, and she already knows. The people who built this world are gone, but the systems they designed, they are still running. On November 16, 2022, the Artemis 1 rocket lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. No crew, a test flight. 98 meters of orange and white metal leaving the ground at 5:47 in the morning, carrying an empty capsule around the moon and back. The largest rocket NASA had ever successfully launched. More powerful than the Saturn V that carried Apollo 11. The coverage was celebratory. The name was mentioned in every headline. Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, the moon, the wilderness. No article mentioned Delos. Here is what is not an accident. The Artemis program was designed from the beginning to do something Apollo never did. It will land the first woman on the lunar surface, the first person of color. It will establish a permanent presence, not a visit, not a flag and a footprint, but a sustained human habitation in the most hostile environment our species has ever attempted to occupy. Apollo went to the moon and came home. Artemis is going to the moon to stay. The brother arrived first, triumphant, celebrated, watched by 600 million people. He planted a flag and left. He carried the armor of control to the most extreme place on Earth's horizon and performed perfection for the entire world to witness. The sister is arriving later. She is going further. She is carrying people who were not allowed in the room the first time, and she is not going to leave. If you know the mythology, if you know what it cost Artemis to remain at the threshold her entire existence, to be the one who protects what is in transition, to guard the spaces between the known and the unknown, then the name is not poetic. It is precise. It is the most accurate name NASA could have chosen for a program designed to go to the place where no human infrastructure exists, where nothing is guaranteed, where the only thing between the crew and death is the quality of the systems that carried them there. Artemis does not go where it is safe. Artemis goes where nothing has been mapped yet. NASA's own documentation, in the Artemis program overview.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Published by the Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate, describes the program's objective not as return, but as sustainable exploration. The word sustainable appears 11 times in the first 10 pages. This is not the language of a visit. It is the language of someone who has decided to stay in the wilderness. The goddess who spent eternity at the edge of the civilized world was chosen, whether deliberately or by the accumulated weight of cultural memory, to carry humanity into the territory where civilization has not yet reached. And one more thing. Every morning, in the hours just before dawn, there is a moment when the sun has not yet risen and the moon is still visible in the sky. Astronomers call it the overlap. the brief window when both are present simultaneously, before Apollo ascends and Artemis withdraws, before they resume the eternal distance they keep from each other. It lasts minutes. It happens every day. It is the only moment in the entire cycle when the twins are in the same sky at the same time. They meet. They do not linger. They separate again. They have been doing this since before human beings had words for what they were watching. The next time you hear the official version of a story, ask yourself, who is holding the pen? We tell ourselves that myths are metaphors, that the Greeks looked at the sky and invented stories to explain what they saw, that Apollo is the sun because someone needed a word for the sun, that Artemis is the moon because the moon needed a name, that the twins are symbols, beautiful, convenient, interchangeable with any other symbol that serves the same purpose. But that is not how myths work. Myths are not explanations. They are recognitions. They are what happens when a culture looks at a pattern of human behavior so universal, so persistent, so resistant to being solved, and decides the only container large enough to hold it is a god. Apollo and Artemis are not the sun and the moon. They are the two things that happen to a person who learns, before they have language for it, that the world is not safe. One becomes control, precision, performance. The armor that looks like perfection from the outside and feels from the inside, like a hand permanently closed around something that must never be allowed to break. Apollo heals because he cannot afford to be the one who needs healing. Apollo achieves because achievement is the only proof he has that he deserves to exist. The other becomes distance, the wilderness, the permanent threshold. Artemis protects everything in transition because she has never completed the transition herself. She guards the edges because the edges are the only place where no one can give her to someone else. She is the most free being on Olympus. She is also the most alone. These are not ancient problems. You know someone who became Apollo. You may be someone who became Artemis. The reason these names have survived 3,000 years, the reason a room full of engineers at NASA reached instinctively for this mythology when they needed words large enough for what they were attempting, is not because the Greeks were poetic. It is because they were accurate. They looked at what abandonment does to a person, and they built two gods out of it. And those gods were so recognizable, so precisely observed, that every civilization that encountered them said yes. That is real. I know those people. The brother went first, celebrated, alone in his achievement, in a way he could never fully explain. The sister is coming now, carrying more, going further, still at the threshold, but this time, the threshold is the moon. If the oldest story in the Western tradition was hiding inside the name of humanity's greatest achievement all along, what else are we still reading on the surface when the real story is underneath? Tell me in the comments. Next video, we uncover the empire that ruled half the known world for 2 centuries and was erased so completely that most people alive today have never heard its name. The gods were never just gods. They were always us. NASA named its greatest achievements after 2 gods who were born in exile. Not metaphorical exile, not poetic exile, actual exile. A pregnant woman wandering the Aegean Sea for months, refused by every land on Earth, giving birth on a barren floating island that said yes only because it had nothing left to lose. That is the origin of the name on the rocket that carried human beings to the moon. The most powerful space agency in history. The organization that turned orbital mechanics into a competitive sport and pointed 12 men at a rock 384,000 kilometers away and brought them home alive. Reached into Greek mythology and chose, as its symbol of human achievement, a god whose first memory was his mother on the ground. We were told Apollo means light. We were told Artemis means the hunt. Both are true. Neither is the point. Because if you go back to the actual sources, not the school version, not the Hollywood version, not the version that ends with radiant gods on golden thrones, what you find is not two symbols of power. What you find is two children who responded to the same wound in opposite directions. One became an armor of control so complete it looked like perfection. The other became a distance so absolute it looked like freedom. And NASA, whether it knew this or not, replicated the entire arc. Apollo went first, triumphant, celebrated, watched by 600 million people. He planted a flag and left. Artemis is coming now. She is going further. She is carrying people who were not in the room the first time. And she is not planning to leave. The question is not why NASA chose these names. The question is why these names were the only ones that fit. But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. Alone in his achievement, in a way he could never fully explain. The sister is coming now, carrying more, going further. Still at the threshold, but this time, the threshold is the moon. If the oldest story in the Western tradition was hiding inside the name of humanity's greatest achievement all along, what else are we still reading on the surface when the real story is underneath? Tell me in the comments. Next video, we uncover the empire that ruled half the known world for 2 centuries and was erased so completely that most people alive today have never heard its name. The gods were never just gods. They were always us. NASA named its greatest achievements after 2 gods who were born in exile. Not metaphorical exile, not poetic exile, actual exile. A pregnant woman wandering the Aegean Sea for months, refused by every land on Earth, giving birth on a barren floating island that said yes only because it had nothing left to lose. That is the origin of the name on the rocket that carried human beings to the moon. The most powerful space agency in history, the organization that turned orbital mechanics into a competitive sport and pointed 12 men at a rock 384,000 kilometers away and brought them home alive, reached into Greek mythology and chose, as its symbol of human achievement, a god whose first memory was his mother on the ground. We were told Apollo means light. We were told Artemis means the hunt. Both are true. Neither is the point.